The way I see it is that most of us Americans do truly do not understand how those dynamics is going to end up impacting us domestically. And why is this important? Because there are about 17 countries lined up to join BRICS. I mean, you can just see. And in your opinion, should this move forward, and I believe it will, are we going to see a fundamental change to the financial structure of the global order?
That's a really critical question, because it has been the sort of stranglehold, if you will, that the United States has had on global financial interactions.
The following is a conversation with Dr. Kenneth Hammond. Professor Hammond received his PhD from Harvard University in History and East Asian Languages in 1994 and has taught at New Mexico State University ever since. Professor Hammond specializes in the history of China in the early modern period, especially the 16th century. Professor Hammond published numerous books and articles on Chinese intellectual and political history. Since 2017, he has been affiliated with the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science in Berlin. He has been a lecturer for the National Geographic Society and for the Smithsonian Institution in China, Central Asia, and Southeast Asia. If you enjoy the content of this channel, make sure to subscribe and connect with me on Twitter at @DWalalu. Here is my conversation with Professor Hammond. To have you once again, Dr. Hammond. It's been, of course, almost a year since we last spoke. How fast
Indeed.
time goes. So what I would like to start with, if you don't mind, is what is your read on the current geopolitical landscape?
Well, it has been an interesting year, certainly, since we last spoke. And I think that, if anything, the situations that we talked about last year have intensified. And of course, new crises have emerged. Fundamentally, I don't think anything has changed in terms of the sort of deeper dynamics that we're seeing unfold. But the flashpoints, the tension points, the sort of the tasks that need to be attended to have certainly proliferated, shall we say. I think that the fundamental issues that are animating this period is the reconfiguration of global geopolitical and economic relationships. That the long period of the ascendancy, if you will, or the hegemony, another way to think of it, of the Western powers, and especially since World War II, centered on the United States. That period, which was, the result of the Industrial Revolution and the ability of the West to create the global colonial and imperial system, that's coming to an end. It really has come to an end with the end of colonialism and with the proliferation, the dissemination of modern productive technologies to many new centers, different centers, most prominently, of course, China, but others as well, so that the monopoly on industrial manufacturing, the main force of sort of wealth production and capital accumulation, has shifted away. Not entirely by any means, but that has set tensions up between the old established core and new areas, whether it's China or Russia or South Asia or parts of Latin America, even Africa, where changes are taking place. And I think, unfortunately, many of the leaders in the West, especially in the United States, have a very anxious view of this process and have taken an approach to it, which I think is unfortunate, of trying to sort of circle the wagons and hang on to the dominance that America has enjoyed, rather than trying to find ways to embrace this change and develop new modes of interaction with these emerging centers. But what that has done is create these situations that we have, the tension with China most prominently, but certainly the expansion of, or the efforts to expand American and European control through the extension of NATO into Eastern Europe and right up to the borders of Russia, precipitating this conflict in Ukraine that's been festering for almost a year now itself. So I think that these dynamics have been, as I say, have only intensified in this past year.
So will it be fair? Will it be fair to say I'm one of those who argue that the geopolitical shift is already underway? The
Well underway.
world is moving from unipolar to a multipolar. It's already underway.
Yes.
But it looks like some school of thoughts in the West are not willing to accept this reality.
Yes.
But what do you think?
Oh, I think that's exactly the core of the problem, that the economic and political elites have enjoyed basically being able to run the world for a long time, for decades, if not a century or so. That's gone. That's fading away. It's not gone entirely yet, but the changes are underway, and they're irreversible. If we just think, for example, of China, which is at the center of so much of this stuff, China's economic development, all that China has to do is achieve a level of sort of average worker productivity, and its economy will be 4 times the size of that of the United States. As it is, per capita productivity in China is still well below that in the United States, but that's changing every single day. And as that happens, and this is just a deep structural reorganization of things. As that happens, China's position in the world is going to return to the way it used to be before, let's say, about 1800 or so, where China was one of the biggest economies, the biggest economy, the most prosperous center in the world. Everybody wanted to trade with China. That's simply the way that things are going to become once again. And that's not dependent upon the particularities of political organizations or things like that. That's just a function of basic demography and economics.
Yeah, well, that's apparently it's very, very clear given now, even economically speaking. I just read the assessments from the World Bank and the IMF suggesting the global economy, how it's going to sort of decelerate. But it was a main focus on China, that the economy of China would only grow to, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, 2.7, according to their assessments.
Yes.
And they were wrong. The reason being because China's economy, at least based on the research that I found from outside the sources of the IMF and World Bank, suggested that Chinese economy grew at a 4.4% in 2022.
Sure.
So that just right there, it tells me what sort of Western entities or institutions are suggesting versus what the reality is.
Yeah, I think that there's often a gap, shall we say, between the message that we hear, at least, from the media, from the government, from these financial and economic institutions in the West. I keep a file, in one of my drawers of articles that I've seen about how China's economic miracle can't last, and these go back to the late 1970s. So this is something that's been, people have been saying this over and over and over again, and obviously there are big changes in China. Those years of growth of GDP of 10, 11, 12%, that's done. But you have to think that what does the growth of let's say 4% even on an economy the size of China's now compare to when it was 10% of an economy that was much smaller? Right? So the rate of growth has slowed, but in fact, the amount of value being produced, the wealth that's being generated, continues to be the main center in the world.
You mentioned the word gap between the institutions when they forecast that. Do you believe, in your opinion, that this gap is intentional? When reports come out suggesting that, well, the Chinese economy is going to collapse and all this stuff. Or do you believe that because there is a misunderstanding, lack of understanding in the West about China, how China thinks, how China proceeds, and so forth?
Yeah, no, what their capacities and capabilities are too. I think that I think actually that it's a combination of things. I think that there is a strong element of wishful thinking. There's a strong element that applies the sort of analytical categories and understandings of Western mainstream economics in looking at the Chinese economy. And what's important in that sense is that many people in the West, in government and media, even in academia, have this belief that China has become itself a capitalist economy. And I think that that's a fundamental misreading, and that's what leads to a lot of this misinterpretation. I think some of it is just sincere misunderstanding. Some of it is wishful thinking. Some of what goes out in mainstream media, I think, is willful kind of projection. But I think that in the West, it's very difficult for political and economic and even media or intellectual leaders sometimes to take seriously the idea that socialism that they talk about in China is a real thing, and that there are aspects of the Chinese system, the strong role of the state-owned enterprises still. They've gone through a lot of change and transformation, but they now constitute one of the most productive sectors in society. The commitment that has been stated and strongly restated under Xi Jinping to exercise control and oversight over private capital so that it doesn't, become entirely exploitative and oppressive. The commitment of the state and the Communist Party, the dominant political force, to address issues in a way that it's very difficult for governments and institutions in the West to do, because there's not a coherent, unified leadership such as there is in China, which doesn't mean that there aren't significant political differences within the party, within the government, but they have a historical political culture in which working to resolve issues takes precedence over a lot of the factional maneuvering or the spectacle that we're seeing right now in the American House of Representatives. It just highlights some of the dysfunctionality that plagues our system. So I think that these projections, this gap, it's a gap of understanding based on the idea simply that they can't take this idea of socialism seriously. They see it, they project onto China or other countries modes of decision making, attitudes which are basically their own.
It's very interesting. You mentioned President Xi Jinping, which leads me to my next question. And the way I want to address this particular aspect is to put it within the context of the U.S.-China relations. As you know, President Xi Jinping has been granted third term. How do you see that's going to impact the future of the U.S.-China relations, given the ongoing trade war, given now the massive sort of support, financial and military, of the U.S. to Taiwan, and given, of course, the other geopolitical conflicts within the global order?
Sure. Well, I'm quite concerned. I think that the U.S.-China relationship is in a very difficult state. I think that it's unlikely, as far as I can see, to improve, certainly on the American side. I think that hostility towards China, the posture of criticism and accusation that is so prevalent in the media here and coming out of the mouths of politicians. This is a bipartisan thing. This isn't something. This is one of the things, a few things on which Democrats and Republicans seem to share a common perspective. They have differences in how they want to go about it, but certainly there's little love or even appreciation or understanding directed towards China on the part of the leadership in government and the media and things like that. So I'm not optimistic that there's going to be an improvement or a turnaround in the direction that U.S.-China relations are taking. However, at the same time, I think that the Chinese have been showing remarkable restraint. The new foreign minister, Qin Yang, who was just the Chinese ambassador here to the United States for the last few years, published a piece, I think, in the Washington Post yesterday or the day before, talking about the need to ensure that there's a stable and an open relationship between the countries. I think that again, it's a classic situation where leaders in the West project onto China the kinds of ambitions or plans, the expansionism, the search for dominance and things like that, which has characterized their own behavior for the last 70 or 80 years. And I think that China, the message that China communicates pretty consistently is very, very different. Is one of, to borrow their own terminology, things like shared prosperity, mutual benefit.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, it's political rhetoric for them as well. But I think that when we look at their behavior, at the actuality of what their conduct in global affairs has been, it's not. It doesn't diverge as far from the reality as American rhetoric sometimes does from the truth. Because this idea, this anxiety that's articulated about China's projection of military power. China's not the country that has 180 military bases around the world. It has one in Djibouti in Northeast Africa, which is part of a United Nations anti-piracy movement. So it's a very, very different situation. But if you just looked at mainstream media in the United States, you would believe that China was gearing up for wars of expansion against India and Southeast Asia and Taiwan and all this kind of stuff. And there's no real substance to that. So I think that as long as politicians talk that way, and as long as the media reproduces that, it's unlikely that there's going to be serious openings for reconciliation, if you will, which is of course very unfortunate. We face very, very deep crises in our own economy, climate change, global warming, all that kind of stuff. We should be looking for partners to work with, rather than people that we want to isolate and try to thwart their development.
Yeah. Well, speaking of Djibouti, I was in Djibouti and I saw the presence of it's very small Chinese presence at the base there in comparison to ours in Okinawa, for example.
Sure.
So you're absolutely correct. Chinese presence in Djibouti is a very, very, very small. I mean, it's not considered militarily or naval assets the way we can understand or interpret that one. So,
sure.
Well, that will lead me to also consider the aspects of, based on what you talked about, is to connect that one to the realities on the global stage. What do I mean by this? My reference is to the Ukraine war, the ongoing Ukraine war. And within that context, the West seems wanted to pressure China to take stand or condemn Russia's actions in Ukraine. And China said, no, we're not going to do that. So could this also was driving the West behavior toward China because of this?
Well, that's certainly an aspect of the overall tensions and antipathies that are directed towards China. China's been very clear right from the start on this, that they have called for negotiation, they've called for ceasefires, they've called for a resolution of the conflict in a way that addresses the interests of both parties. China and Russia have a friendly relationship. They have a relationship based upon certain shared interests, and as the Chinese like to say, on the pursuit of mutual benefit. But that doesn't mean that China and Russia, that China certainly sees Russia as sharing the Chinese system, or sharing even, like we can say, Chinese values, things like that. China has its own its effort to build a socialist economy and improve the livelihoods of its people. It has its own approach to all those issues. We can talk about that stuff as well if we want. But Russia has a very different system, and frankly, not a particularly progressive one. But Russia has sought to remain autonomous or aloof from the global economic dominance of the United States and the Europeans, the Western Europeans especially. And so, the fundamental driving motivation in American foreign policy is to extend the opportunities, to create the opportunities for American capital, American corporations to go wherever they want and engage in profit generating activities. And if a country is open to that, and a country
Mhm.
says, sure, come on in, do what you want, then they're great. We look at a country like Saudi Arabia, which has a domestic situation that I think most Americans would find not particularly comfortable. But they are one of the biggest recipients of American assistance and military aid, a close ally. President Biden goes there and shakes hands with the Crown Prince. That's based on very particular conception of that relationship. A country, on the other hand, like Venezuela, which is a poor country struggling to improve the lives of its people because it won't accommodate itself to American interests, is demonized and sanctioned, and let alone thinking of a country like Cuba. So what matters in American foreign policy is, are you or are you not willing to be subordinated to the interests of American capital?
Yeah.
And Russia has not been, and so that's a fundamental, deep contradiction there. China is not going to throw its weight behind the American position. China is not going to become a tool, a pawn, or whatever you want to call it, in the American effort to maintain and perpetuate its global dominance, its global hegemony. That, if nothing else, leaving aside all the other things we've just been talking about, that would be enough for China to go into the bad column as far as American foreign policy is viewed, because it's if you're not our friend, if you will, in other words, if you're not willing to accommodate America's interests, then it's a Manichaean world. Then you're the enemy. You're a bad country, and we're going to try to do bad things to you. So of course, China's not going to denounce Russia. China, if anything, has tried to remain aloof from these American efforts to pursue its to publicize and make its view of the Russian situation, the Ukrainian situation, dominant. China's not alone in that. I mean, India, which of course is supposed to be a great American ally, also has declined to go along with the American positions at the UN and things, as have the governments of countries representing about 60% of the people on Earth. So this effort to claim that America has united everybody and we're going to eliminate those naughty Russians, that's just fantasy talk.
Yeah. Well, same thing happened with even ASEAN meeting that took place in Phnom Penh, Cambodia, and the G20 summit. Indonesia invited Russia and resisted the call by the members of the Western or collective West, that is, to condemn Russia. They said, no, we're going to invite Russia, and it's up to them to decide whether they want to attend G20 summit or not. And as we all know, President Putin didn't go, but Sergei Lavrov represented Russia for that one. So this one leads me to, because I argued this before, Professor. I argued this in my latest Russian book, by which I stated that the rapprochement between Russia and China will eventually serve both countries, given the shifting sands on the global landscape.
Yes.
But I also argued that this rapprochement is not going to translate into, for example, a military alliance in the traditional sense that you and I understand, when one country comes to the defense of the other. So, but I do see the signs, or have been seeing the signs, for example, economically speaking, when we consider now, for example, the trade in energy between Russia and China. What do you make of that moving forward within the context of BRICS, Brazil, Russia, China, India, and South Korea?
Sure. Well, I think that the energy trade, oil, natural gas, things like this that have been coming out of Russia, obviously the sanctions that have been imposed by the United States and by NATO, and the the disruptions that have taken place. Russia is not selling the volume of energy products to the West that it was, and the idea was, that'll disrupt the Russian economy. It'll break them down, and they'll have to cave in.
Yeah.
Instead, what we've seen is that that market has shifted. China, India, other countries are buying more resources from Russia. The Russian economy has not collapsed. I mean, it's certainly not running at full steam, but they are, they're carrying on, going forward, and all that. And I think that it's not in the interest of other countries like China and India, Indonesia, Latin American countries that have spoken out in solidarity with, not in solidarity, but in not have declined to join the American drumbeat. It's not in their interests for Russia to collapse, for Russia to cave into American interests or American objectives. So, there's this understanding, and that I think that the more serious thinkers and analysts within the political leadership of the United States must be able to understand that. They must be able to look at this, leaving aside what they say in public, because that's just rhetoric.
That's different.
But leaving that aside, they must hopefully, be able to see that this political shift, this unwillingness of other governments in the global South to even pay lip service to these American objectives. This signals, this is a clear marker of these fundamental changes that are taking place. It's just a matter of realism on the part of these countries that the future, doesn't lie in the perpetuation of American domination. The future lies in this multicentric, multipolar world where countries are interacting with each other, hopefully in better ways than a lot of what's going on. China's Belt and Road Initiative is one example, but there certainly are others. The collaboration, the BRICS, grouping is a good one, and things happening that haven't for a long time in Africa, for example, infrastructure development, investment, things like that. I think that people around the world are looking at these changing realities and saying, well, the future appears to be moving in this way. Why should we tie ourselves to these declining interests of the United States? And again, it's so unfortunate and so unnecessary for American politicians to take the attitude that they're taking of, we're not going to put up with this. We're not going to accept this. They don't have a choice as whether they're going to accept it. They can say, I don't accept it, but this is going to happen. And it would just be so much better to take a more pragmatic, down-to-earth approach and say, well, how can we work together to solve these other very, very serious problems confronting us?
Yeah. Well, as one who works in Washington, D.C., it will be a tough sell.
Yeah.
For those politicians to absorb something like this. But the way I see it, Professor Hammond, the way I see it is that most of us Americans truly do not understand how those dynamics is going to end up impacting us domestically. And my reference is, for example, to BRICS. And why is this important? Because there are about 17 countries lined up to join BRICS moving forward. I believe the upcoming summit is going to be in South Africa this year, by which Iran has proposed or submitted its application. Saudi Arabia wants to join. Turkey wants to join. I mean, you can just see. And in your opinion, should this move forward, and I believe it will, are we going to see a fundamental change to the financial structure of the global order? Meaning,
that's a really critical question, because it has been the sort of stranglehold, if you will, that the United States has had on global financial interactions through things like the International Bank of Settlements, right? Let alone things like the IMF and the World Bank. So long as this dollar-dominated system centered on the settlement of international debts that had to pass through New York, pass through, even though it's just computers now, it's just these electronic blips, but still they're conceptually, theoretically routed through the United States. That's what gives the United States the ability to impose all these sanctions, to go around and say, we're gonna freeze your assets, we're gonna sanction these people, we're gonna do these various things that they have had the capacity to do. They've had the capacity to reach in and stop the flow, stop the settlements. Think of a country like the DPRK, North Korea, that its ability to conduct business internationally is so circumscribed by these controls that the United States has maintained. That too is changing, and the more countries that participate in that, whether it's simply shifting to a basket of currencies approach.
Mhm.
China, of course, is to some extent promoting the idea of the renminbi as an international currency. They've
Mhm.
been moving very carefully and very slowly on that because they're worried about vulnerabilities in their own domestic monetary situation. But that is a direction things have been going.
Mhm.
And I think that they've been creating also Asian Development Bank, other kinds of financial institutions in conjunction both with BRICS and with the Belt and Road Initiative.
Mhm.
That these systems are changing. They're not going to change overnight. It's not flipping a light switch,
For
but
sure.
it's a matter of constructing new mechanisms so that country X and country Y can trade with each other without that having to be routed through the United States and therefore made vulnerable to American political intervention.
Which is exactly what we're seeing right now between, for example, Russia and China regarding
Yes,
energy trade,
yes,
between Russia and India. Because India said to the United States, no, we're going to buy oil from Russia and pay in rupees,
yes,
whether you like it or not. And they moved on with it. So, uh,
yeah,
yeah, because that's where I'm seeing the challenges that some of us Americans do not understand the ramification of when the dollar becomes weaker, how that's
yeah.
going to impact us.
Well, it's not just the dollar being weaker in terms of exchange,
Mm,
but no longer the currency that everything else has to be managed through. In other words,
mm,
rupees, rubles, renminbi, they're all beginning with the R. But as that changes, yeah. I mean, the impact on the American economy will be significant, and the
yeah.
impact on American corporations, which then, of course, filters down to ordinary people pretty directly, is going to be significant. And American businesses, I think, many of them, want to be more flexible and more adaptive. But the government has become increasingly interventionist
Yeah.
and sort of dirigist. This move that's going on to compel companies like Samsung in Korea, TSMK in Taiwan, to relocate productive facilities to the United States. This is not in the best interest of those companies, but the U.S. wants to gain greater control over those productive technologies and sort of marginalize what
Mhm.
have been these great centers of productivity in ways that really it's not very forward looking.
Yeah. Well, I look at it in the microchip issue between the US and China. As a matter of fact, for the reallocation of the TSMK to Arizona, I believe, the US needs
Yes.
about $50 billion just to establish that, which it's not going to work in the long term. What the US policymakers didn't understand or realize is by embarking on an initiative like this, you are now forcing China to create its own. And it's doing that to begin. It's no different than the space station.
Yeah.
China
Yeah.
went ahead and built its own.
Right.
So they're not going to
No,
be.
China's efforts to develop its semiconductor industry have been
Yeah.
ongoing and increasingly successful. And when we look at some of the technological things that China has been able to accomplish over the years, everything from making the best solar panels in the world to to their own space station. Now they're talking about manned missions to the moon. They have the technical capabilities. They've invested in engineering and science and technology education. Their research institutes are world class. Because it's a growing, expansive, dynamic, forward-looking economy, society, culture, whatever you want to call it. And the idea that somehow we're going to stop China from having the ability to
No.
produce these chips to advance their computers and their AI research and things like that. That's just not going to happen. We can slow them down. We can make it more difficult for them, but it's not going to stop it. And of course, so what's the long-term prospect of that? What's the benefit of that? Pardon the language, but it just pisses them off.
Right.
It's frustrating, and it's not a way of building a positive future. It's a way of sort of it's a futile gesture that
Mm.
that's only going to have negative consequences in the long run.
Wow. Just to go back to the financial part, because there is one thing I've been thinking about it, and I was wondering, and I kept it in my mind to address it with you, is that will it be fair to say that we are at the end of Bretton Woods system?
Oh, I think very much so. I mean, the Bretton Woods began to break down back in the 70s.
Hmm.
Things like the Volcker shock, and
Yeah.
well, even just the U.S. Going off of the metallic standards and things
Mhm.
like that. So it's been weakened, but that was that if anything, that represented a kind of dispersion of authority amongst the advanced capitalist economies. It meant that Germany and Japan, Britain, France, their situation could change. But it didn't really change the position of the dollar in the larger developing world economy, right?
Mhm.
So there was that initial phase of shifting with the Bretton Woods system. But now I think, yeah, now that's just a dead letter. You know, that the role of the dollar, it's certainly not done yet, but it is definitely declining, and alternatives, viable, functional alternatives, are in fact emerging and developing. I'm not particularly sophisticated or savvy about all this crypto stuff,
Yeah.
the cryptocurrencies and so on.
Mhm.
But of course, that's also an area in which some countries, China included, seem to be quite interested in development, and that also will decenter global financial relationships in new ways that as I say, I'm not
Right.
particularly I don't particularly understand them, but I do understand that these are changes that are going to further erode and transform that global financial and monetary network.
Yeah. Well, one thing, Professor Hammond, that I am very comfortable saying is that the trends I'm seeing on the financial market, and I'm not a financial advisor, and I'm not, but I do understand the basics of it, is that the trends that I'm seeing is that when you go back 20 years, for example, just 20 years, we'll go back 20 years, and you look at some countries that have been sort of amassing gold. I'll take the example of Russia. I'll take the example of China. To me, that's an indication for probably that time now is here for these countries now to really shift away from the US dollar completely. And doing so, it's going to sort of compel other countries who transact with those like China, Russia, and so forth to bypass the US dollar altogether.
Yeah.
And this is what leads me to think in terms of what role are we going to see regarding gold moving forward, in your opinion?
Well,
What do you make of it?
you know, the whole matter of the precious metals, gold, silver,
Hmm.
as monetary symbols, I suppose you would say, as the idea of backing a currency
Currency.
with gold reserves.
Yeah.
The sheer volume of um, wealth
Hmm.
of cash in one way or another that sloshes around in the global system these days far exceeds any actual physical stock of gold. So I don't think we're looking at going back to a situation where a country's only going to be able to produce X amount of currency based upon the number of bars of gold sitting in Fort Knox or something like that.
Yeah.
But I do think that countries, especially poorer developing countries, can look at things like gold and perhaps other commodities as stores of wealth, as it's sometimes put, so that they have a balance, they have something by way of an asset that isn't just a resource that's going to be stripped away by foreign exploitation or something like that. I don't think it's insignificant that one of the things that the United States has done in its efforts to suppress Venezuela is to embargo their gold reserves. They held huge amounts of gold in banks in England, in London,
right?
And the United States, not the British, but the United States, you can't have access to that.
Wow.
So obviously, the place of gold, while I don't think it's ever going to return to the fundamental role that it used to have, is not insignificant, and it certainly can be a factor in especially in particular situations, as I say, of poorer developing countries.
Okay. Then, well, let's move into addressing Europe, the EU, if we may. Then after that, we'll move back to Asia, because there are specific key questions I'd like to ask. So for Europe, just in general term, in your opinion, where do you see the energy crisis that is looming large now, impacting industries within the European Union?
Well, it's impacting industries. It's also really impacting individuals. This past fall, I spent a couple of months in Italy and a month in London, and talking with friends and acquaintances and colleagues in both places. There is very, very deep concern about just paying your heating bill as we move into the winter, but also questions about the ability of productive corporations to maintain their operations. And of course, if that becomes problematic, that leads to unemployment, that leads to layoffs of various kinds. It further disrupts what has already been a complicated situation because of the pandemic in terms of supply chains and all that. So I think that the problems that are being faced in Europe are significant and are going to intensify. And what's perhaps most interesting about that is that that's leading to some ruptures, if you will, in the relationships within the European Union. Not just countries like Hungary, which have been pretty clear in wanting to stay away from the sanctions and trying to maintain a more pragmatic and balanced relationship with Russia in terms of accessing their energy resources. But even Italy, has been very clear that they're going to try to prioritize the interest of their people, at least on a basic sort of consumer level, and they're not entirely happy with the situation in terms of the sanctions and all that as well. And I think that we're going to see more both popular expressions of this, and there have been big demonstrations across Europe. We don't hear much about
that.
But 40,000 people in Prague, for example, a few weeks ago, protesting against the sanctions, protesting against the ongoing, military expenditures, all the money that's being pumped into Ukraine by the United States and by NATO. Of course, that's money that could be being spent helping people, take care of their families and their education and things like that. So, I think that initially, when the war in Ukraine began, there seemed to be quite widespread support amongst many people in Europe. But just, I think as this has gone on and it has been pretty clear that the American strategy is to pump in enough resources to keep the war going in the hopes of bleeding Russia down, but not obviously doing anything that would make a decisive resolution take place, and at the same time being unwilling to sort of allow, and the irony of that is crazy, to allow the Ukrainians to enter into negotiations. This idea that we're not going to talk about this. It's win or nothing. It's just a crazy situation, and I think a lot of people in Europe are getting very frustrated with that. Whether or how that will translate through into political action, other than, as I say, in a country like Hungary, where the government is already at variance with the overall EU policy. I think that remains to be seen. But certainly in Britain right now, a lot of people are having a very, very difficult time. Of course, Britain's no longer part of the EU, but what happens there will have an impact on the broader European situation as well.
Yeah, well, we don't hear much about this, given our own problems domestically here with the inflation, for example, and the where things are headed here in the U.S.
Sure.
Well, you look at it no further than the U.S. defense budget, the $858 billion. So it's like, okay, what is the increase for when we have issues to deal or needs to fix here at home?
Sure.
So speaking of the budget, I'm going to move it. I'm going to move the conversation towards Asia. And the reason I want to mention this is because the defense budget plays a role into this for two things. One has to do with there is a clause. I looked at the defense budget bill, by the way. I read some of it. And one particular clause that drew my attention, it has to do with allocating $1 billion a year to Taiwan for military.
Yeah.
That's one. And second thing has to do with Japan increasing its military budget to about $315 billion, which makes it the third largest military in the world after US and China. How do you think, in your opinion, Professor Hammond, China will interpret this kind of initiatives by the US?
Well, I think they'll interpret them pretty clearly and pretty straightforwardly as the efforts, part of this ongoing effort by the United States to encircle, contain, China, whatever the best terminology would be, to try to thwart China's continuing development. The lessons of the Soviet Union, the former Soviet Union, are not lost on the Chinese. In the 1980s, under President Reagan, the new arms race, the objective of that was not, in fact, to develop defensive capabilities for the United States. We had all these nuclear missiles. We had plenty of military power at that point, but was to drive the Soviets to have to spend money trying to develop their own weapon systems. That took money away from their economy, from the needs of their people. And this was a major factor in the final collapse of the Soviet Union and the Eastern European states. And, Reagan won the Cold War by driving the Soviet Union bankrupt, basically. That's not going to happen with China. But, Joe Biden is basically a lingering Cold Warrior. And that seems to be what his mentality is, that by putting these kinds of military pressures on China, the hope is that China will divert resources into bolstering its military. And certainly China has been developing its military. It has capabilities now that it's never had before. These are overwhelmingly defensive. China is not building up an aggressive force to go out and take over the world, but they face very, very real and substantial threats, or at least that's their strategic perception. And so they have been bolstering their military. It's still a fraction of the American military, and of course, on a per capita basis, their military spending is tiny compared to that in the United States. But these kinds of actions, these kinds of gestures, it's not just to pit Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, the same thing. The deployment of these the THAAD missile systems there, which China has not been happy about. Efforts down in the South China Sea, efforts to bring in the Australians, selling them nuclear submarines, this kind of stuff. There's a full court press on by the United States, just in a straightforward military way. Right up against the borders, the coast of China. China's not installing military bases in Mexico or sending submarines into the Long Island Sound or something. It's the United States that projects its power out in the world that way. I think that within that larger framework, we can think about two particular aspects. With regard to Japan, this idea of having the Japanese bolster their budget, assume a more significant role in military affairs. That's part of a what has been a kind of ongoing theme in American politics of getting our allies to sort of pay their fair share, to carry a greater share of the burden, and of course there's an amnesia about why it is that Germany or Japan had such small militaries. We did that after World War II for perfectly reasonable choices. But the Japanese Constitution, which has forbidden the use of force to resolve international conflict or international problems, that's a result of the end of the war, end of World War II, and the American occupation. We guided the rewriting of the Japanese Constitution, all that. Now we want them to, pay more, take a greater share of the costs, but still subordinate their military capabilities to American interests, right? So I think that's one aspect of it. When we look at Taiwan, I think that there's a very important thing that the Taiwanese leadership should keep in mind, and they need to look at Ukraine. They need to look at the situation there and see that, yes, the United States is pumping billions and billions of dollars in there, but what is their real objective? What is it that they were giving them the capability to do? What we're giving them, what we want to go on there, what the American leadership wants to go on there is this prolonged, protracted war to bleed the Russians, to hopefully weaken support for Putin, maybe generate dissent within the military leadership or popular unrest or whatever, and that way as a way of weakening Russia and perhaps eventually getting them to cave into American interest. Well, the calculus for Taiwan, at least to some degree, appears to be somewhat similar. We're going to build up their military capabilities. At the same time, as we were just talking about, that we're trying to extract productive technologies from them by getting the chip makers to relocate to Arizona. And what's the thinking there? What's the goal there? At least in part, I think there may be a fantasy that if they could generate some sort of localized military conflict across the straits, that would draw China's resources. It would slow down their economic development. It's a terribly cynical approach to the relationship. And Taiwan winds up just being a patsy. Taiwan winds up being a platform, a sacrificial altar, if you will, for American policy interests. A war across the straits isn't going to be in the interest of anybody on either side. It's not in China's interest. It's not in the interest of the local authorities in Taiwan. There's so much interaction between the island and the rest of the country. Billions and billions of dollars in investment. Hundreds of thousands of people from Taiwan living and working on the mainland. Millions of tourists from the mainland going to Taiwan every year. The economies have become so closely interconnected that any actual physical conflict would be devastating for both sides. Who would not be hurt by that? The United States. At least that's their thinking, I fear. And so, this bolstering of military posture on China's, what do you call it, the first island chain. It's very dangerous. It's very short-sighted and cynical on the part of the United States. And it's something that especially in Taiwan, the people politically paying attention should be paying attention to that.
Well, I do believe the recent domestic elections in Taiwan sent a clear message to Tsai in the sense that we don't want any tensions with motherland.
Yeah, very, very much so. The local elections, the DPP did not perform very well. And the Kuomintang, the old nationalist party, did actually much better than expected, as did a couple of other parties. And I think that reflects what we see often in in the public opinion polls in Taiwan, both those conducted locally and some conducted by American pollsters as well,
Yeah.
which show that there's this huge sort of middle ground in public opinion in Taiwan. You have a group of maybe 12 to 15% who say yes, they support independence. You have another group, maybe roughly comparable down at the other end of the spectrum, saying we'd like to have immediate reunification. But in the middle, you have maybe 70% or 80% of the people saying we just want to go get along with our lives. We don't want to have conflict with China. We don't want to declare independence. We just want to, let things remain as they have been. We just want to carry on as we have been. And that actually is very much in line with the official position, which was just restated by Xi Jinping at the 20th Party Congress, that this is an issue to be resolved by the Chinese people on both sides of the strait in their own time, in their own way. It's something that's come down from history. There's no need to push it. There's no need to disrupt it right now. It's sort of functioning. Both sides can talk. Both sides can pursue their interests. But let's resolve it, over the long term. The disruptive force in the Taiwan situation isn't China. It isn't even the Taiwanese leadership, except for some. It's the United States, and again, it's just part of this push to try to derail China's progress.
Yeah. That's why I suspect, Professor Hammond, I suspect that the increase of Japan's military budget is aimed at ensuring for the upcoming elections in 2024 in Taiwan. It's almost like the U.S. pressured Japan to get ready just in case. I mean, we all know, those of us who think pragmatically, China's not going to invade Taiwan. How can you invade your own country? That's like the U.S. invading Hawaii. It just doesn't make sense. Of course, we use the term invasion here because that's the only connotation the Western audience will understand. Usually I just don't see it that way because China has other means if they ever want to do that. But how can you do that against your own citizens? They're not going to do that. That's what I believe the Japanese defense budget increase is aimed at. I could be wrong.
I think that makes good sense.
Yeah. I hope I'm wrong, but that's how I see it. This leads me to ask the question, Professor Hammond, do you think some of us Americans understand what it will cost us to slide into a war with the nuclear power? What I'm referring to is this China and Taiwan issue.
Yeah, I don't think so at all. I think that so much propaganda has come out. There's been such a consistent and relentless campaign of demonization against China, on such a broad spectrum of issues. It's like it's anything that China does seems to be constructed as bad, right? And so that this fairly relentless drumbeat of that message, I think most Americans, they don't have a lot of other sources of knowledge or information about China. Most Americans certainly don't read Chinese or speak Chinese. Most Americans don't speak any foreign language, but certainly not Chinese. And we don't really have much access to information coming out of China other than, Western mainstream media. And for example, right now, of course, China is changing its policy package on COVID, and after 3 years of being criticized every day for the draconian measures that they were taking to control COVID, now they have made decisions based on their scientific understanding that the new variants are not as lethal, not as deadly, and that this is the moment when trying to move towards a new posture is good. Trying to both change the public health environment and change the economy, get the economy to be a little more robust again. But of course, now they're being criticized for that, right?
Mhm.
And one of the things we hear every day in the media here is that, oh, you can't trust Chinese statistics, right? That basically saying they're lying about the number of people who are dying or whatever. There's an article in the Guardian today trotting out that same line, and that
Yeah.
too it's a way of sort of reinforcing the knowledge gap, because it's not just that the only things they hear about China come from our media, but it's also necessary to create the idea that anything you hear from China itself is not reliable. You can't believe it. You can't trust it. And of course, that what that means is that if you try to communicate knowledge or information that comes out of China, regardless of what the basis of it is, regardless of what you know, whether it's something you've seen with your own eyes or things that you've read or whatever, it's automatically pre-devalued, if you will. And I think that creates a political environment in the United States, which is itself very dangerous. I work with an organization called Pivot to Peace that is dedicated to trying to reduce the misunderstanding, reduce the fear mongering, and push back against the hostility that's directed towards China. But it is a very, very much an uphill battle of trying to combat the messages that emanate from the media and politicians pretty much every day. So yeah, I think most Americans are good-hearted people. They want to live in a
Yeah.
in a peaceful world. They want to live in a world where they can go about their own lives and improve the situations for themselves and their families. But they're subjected to this endless torrent of negative information or negative stories about China, and so that makes it very difficult for people to have any kind of disinterested or pragmatic understanding or approach to political questions.
Yeah. Well, that's what made me think about literally what will become of the future of U.S.-China relations. I've been for the last couple months, and since President Xi Jinping being granted third term, that was the first question that came to my mind: is what will become of U.S.-China relations, given now how our politicians in Washington, pushing certain narratives. We're not saying that China has its own problems. It's not
Of
a
course,
perfect system.
of
There is
course,
no such thing to begin
right.
with. You know, it just we don't seem to understand the Chinese mindset, how they see things or how they perceive or whatever that case might be. And it might be the same for them. They might not be able to understand how we see things here internally. So that was one of the issues that made me think about what will become of it. So I would like to address one final segment here, if you're okay with it.
Sure.
And this one has to do, Professor Hammond, with the uh, Senkaku Island. Is known as Senkaku Island. It is also known as, I found the term here, how it's pronounced in Chinese. It's called Diaoyutai.
Jiao
You know,
Yutai.
Diaoyutai. So this one goes back to when Japan defeated China in 1894-1895 war. But I did find in the archives that it was a declaration that the islands belong to China, not to Japan.
Right.
It was I did read it, and I have a document that I kept a copy of it. So where do you see the tension between? Because it's a sort of a settled behind the scenes tensions between China and Japan. You know,
Right.
and where do you see this is going? Given that it was the United States that hands those islands to Japan after World War II, as you know.
Right. Well, this the situation with that little archipelago, those islands,
Hmm.
Senkaku is what the Japanese call them,
Mhm.
Diaoyutai, which means the fisherman's terrace.
Hmm.
The Diaoyutai Islands, that's the Chinese term. They're located just off the northern tip of the island of Taiwan, and The history, yeah, they were when Taiwan was taken by Japan as a result of the defeat of China in 1895. Um, they went along with that because they were part of what was at that point Taiwan province. Taiwan had become a province in the Qing Empire, administratively it had been part of Fujian province, but then it was separated in the 1880s. And then, so when Taiwan province was ceded to Japan, those islands, the Diaoyutai Islands, went along. Prior to that, and this gets down to sort of the nub of it, in the 1870s, Japan, which was going through its own modernization and all that, was trying to emulate the economic and political models of the West. They had seen the conquest of India, the humiliation of China in the Opium Wars. The United States shows up in the 1850s and opens Japan by force. Commodore Perry and the U.S. Navy. And the Japanese made a very careful calculation, very quick calculation, that resisting Western imperialism wasn't really going to be a great option for them. But what they wanted to do was strengthen themselves to the point where they could achieve a kind of parity, achieve a kind of recognition of their equality, and they were very successful at that. That's a whole long story. But in doing that, what they wanted to do was emulate the Western model, and they looked at things like educational institutions and political organizations, all this. But they also looked at the conduct of the Western powers out in the world, and what they saw was that they went wherever they wanted and took over other people's countries for their own benefit. So they began to pursue their own course of expansion. And we know that they had their sights on Korea, which they finally annexed in 1910. They invaded Manchuria in 1931, et cetera, et cetera. But the very first instance of that was that Japan, Imperial Japan, took over the island chain that today we call Okinawa, which used to be an independent country called in Japanese or in Okinawan called Ryukyu, and in Chinese it was called Liuqiu, and it was a kingdom. They paid tribute both to China and Japan for centuries as an independent state in the East Asian region. But I think it's 1876 or 77, Japan takes over the Ryukyu Islands, incorporates them into the empire. They did not, at that point, take over the Diaoyutai Islands, Senkaku in Japanese, because that was part of China, that was part of Taiwan. So there was a recognition all the way back then that those islands really belonged to China, were part of China. So that's one thing. And then, as you say, they were, when Taiwan went to Japan in 1895, those islands went along. After World War II, 50 years later, the U.S. makes this commitment that territories seized by Japan at the beginning of the war would be returned to their former sovereignty. And that included Taiwan. And by extension, that would include those islands. But because the United States was looking at Okinawa as a center for its post-war military occupation and establishment, they kept all the islands, including Senkaku, Diaoyutai, and said, no, this is actually part of Japanese territory. So that was the intervention that created the tension that we have today. And what's interesting today is that we think about this tension as one between China and Japan, which it certainly is. But the local authorities on the island of Taiwan also assert their sovereignty over that set of islands. And so this isn't, which is actually exactly the same as the situation in the South China Sea. If you buy a map in Taipei, a map of China, right? Of course, it shows the mainland and Taiwan as one country. It's the Republic of China. That's their view of it. But they also show the South China Sea as part of that, and they show the Diaoyutai Islands as part of that. That's the same claim that the government authorities on Taiwan make. It's exactly the same as the mainland, the central government authorities in Beijing. So it's a tension. If we want to talk about these as distinct entities. It
Mhm.
is a tension between China and Japan. It's also a tension between Taiwan and Japan, but we
Mm.
never talk about that. You know, it's like, oh, how unreasonable the Chinese are about this. These little islands, but it's actually Taiwan. That they're part of that territory.
Mm.
So it's kind of a funny situation.
Very interesting. Well, now I can see why. For example, just to go back to the Japan military defense budget, it's raising alarm bells on the international. That's the way
Absolutely.
I see it. Because when you look at history with this kind of context, you can see why there would be. I am sure there is a major concern in Asia as a whole for these announcements because it was just approved on December 23rd. Kushida's government approved the budget.
Yes.
So
Yes.
that so with this context, it put this in perspective. So I can see why. I can see why. Any any final thoughts, Professor Hammond, for our international audience? Just what would you like them to know as far as some words of wisdom, but also for our American audience because we don't seem to know much about what's going on.
Well, the Chinese have an old saying that has had a lot of current usage as well, which is to seek truth from facts, right?
Hmm.
And I think that just as we've been talking about, it's so dangerous to make decisions about world significant events, especially on a basis of only partial knowledge. And so, my hope, my wish is that Americans, all up and down the system, would learn more, would educate themselves more, would try to find out what the real truth is about what goes on in China, what China's country is like, what the society is like, what the people are like, what their behavior and their history has been like in terms of their conduct in the world. Because I think that when people know each other, when people
Hmm.
have they understand each other's ideas and motivations and behaviors, then it's a lot easier to find common interests and to find a path toward a future where we try to improve things for everybody. We try to save the planet and make it a place where people can live productive lives in a cleaner world. I think that that's a very challenging enterprise right now. I greatly, David, appreciate the opportunity to share ideas and thoughts with you through this kind of forum, because this is exactly the kind of effort that we need to be making to try to seek some truth from facts and operate in a world that's based on that kind of approach.
Amen to that. It's very important for world peace. So, well, on behalf of the entire team at Geopolitics in Conflict, we couldn't thank you enough, Professor Hammond, for really carving out time for us to share your knowledge and insight. So, and to our viewers, I'm sure you will find Professor Hammond's insight very useful in helping you understand the bigger picture. I'm sure we're gonna invite Professor Hammond again on the show, and we can't thank you enough for your time. Thank you
It's an
very much,
honor to be
Professor
here.
Hammond.
I'd be delighted to come back anytime.
Thank you so much.
You bet.